In today's short lecture, I want to dig in a little bit more into characteristics of self-concept and the idea of self-concept. So the first thing that I want to point out is that self-concept is subjective. So what that means in essence is that our self-concept varies and is not necessarily accurate in many cases. For example, college students rate their communication skills much higher than they actually are. Indeed, we all tend to rate ourselves as above average, particularly when it comes to things like communication. But of course, by definition, half of us are below average. So there's no way that most of us can be, in fact, above average. Further, in a recent study, 25% of students rated themselves in the top 1% of communicators. Now, obviously, these numbers don't work, and it shows us that we tend to think that we're better at a lot of things than we really are. Now, of course, not all distorted self-concept is positive, and some people suffer from long-term bouts of negative or overly critical kinds of self-image. Now, there's a lot of reasons for these distorted self-evaluations. Some of them can be based on obsolete information. So, in other words, you're basing your idea of yourself on things that are simply no longer true. That information is outdated. So, let's say in middle school you were kind of awkward and you were the ugly duckling. Well, you might be in college now and have really changed physically and be quite attractive, but still think of yourself as the ugly duckling from middle school. In a situation like that, you're making a self-evaluation that's based on outdated info or obsolete information. Sometimes we also base these self-evaluations on distorted feedback. We can have overly critical parents, overly critical spouses, bosses, people who just don't treat us fairly rather, and give us negative ideas about ourselves. Then, of course, there's also perfectionism. We look at people, we look at others, and we say, oh man, everyone else's life is perfect. I should be perfect too. And the reality is that everybody feels that way and that no one is perfect. Then finally, there are social expectations. We tend to reward behavior that downplays strengths. You know, there's that saying that from the Bible that the meek shall inherit the earth. And we like people who aren't too high on themselves, who aren't stuck up, quote unquote, right? So there are social expectations for humility that sometimes lead us to create negative or distorted self-evaluations. Now, sometimes, as I indicated in the last short lecture, we look to the internet to make our reflected appraisals. So how communicators draw conclusions about themselves, right? This is by considering how other people view them online. So again, let me say that again, that was awkward. How communicators draw conclusions about themselves by considering how others view them online. This is internet-mediated reflected appraisal. So it's the same thing as comparing yourself to others, but you're doing it on the internet. Now, most folks seem to think they look pretty good online. But my question is, are these accurate portrayals? So, for example, when you take that picture to post of yourself on Instagram, when you take that selfie, do you just snap a selfie and post the first one that you take? Chances are you don't. Chances are you take about 100 pictures and you try and find the best one and you do some photoshopping and some editing and then you post that one, right? So then there becomes a question as to whether or not these images that we put out there are really authentic. And that's a tricky question. I'm not really sure if they are or if they aren't. But it's interesting to think about. Now, as I spoke about also in the last lecture, there's this idea of cognitive conservatism. And this is the tendency to cling to an existing self-concept, even when evidence shows that it is obsolete. So this is the idea that you have a hard time giving up on ideas of who you think you are, even if these things don't apply anymore. So I'll give you an example. In my mind, even though I'm 47 years old, I still feel like I'm 20 years old. And in my head, I think of myself in that same way a lot of times. Now, when I was 20 years old, my waist was 6 inches smaller, right? I was 50 pounds lighter. I had a lot fewer gray hairs and wrinkles, but I still kind of think of myself that way, even though that idea of who I am is obsolete. It's gone. It doesn't work anymore. So that's an example of cognitive conservatism. We also find that we seek out people that support our self-concept. We tend to seek out people who treat us in a way that we think is appropriate for who we think we are. So if you have a positive self-concept, if you think well about yourself, you'll probably seek out people who see you in a positive light. At the same time, if you think negatively of yourself, you'll probably tend to look for people who treat you in a negative fashion, or people that you think don't like you. You know, lots of times we see people involved in relationships and we say, why would she ever date a guy like that? He treats her terribly. Or why would he date a girl like that? She treats him terribly. Well, in those cases, the people just might have negative self-concepts, and they're seeking out people who reinforce that negative self-concept. Unfortunately, that's something that we do. We often cling to old ideas of self, even when new conceptions might serve us better. So again, this is the idea that I think of myself as 20-year-old Erik, even though I'm 47-year-old Erik. And there might be better ways of thinking about myself. But it's hard to find those because I cling to the old ideas. This is, for example, why many people stick with bad habits and bad relationships and things where they'd be much better served to give them up. But they just can't bring themselves to do it. Because, you know, once you start thinking of yourself as, oh, I'm a hard drinker, or hey, I'm a smoker, or, you know, any of these things, giving up on those qualities can be really hard, even if it's beneficial for you to do so. So, real quick, let's just talk about some ways to improve your self-concept. So the first one is just to try and have a realistic perception of yourself. This can be really hard. You're one of the hardest people to get to know in the world, right? I mean, it's hard to know yourself. So one of the things that you can do, even if you can't achieve a realistic perception of yourself, is just to try and think of yourself in a positive manner and surround yourself with positive people. Also, it's good to have realistic expectations, right? Don't try and set the bar too high for yourself and then be disappointed when you miss things, right? Live day to day, set realistic goals, and achieve them, because the more you achieve them, the more momentum you pick up. Also, have the will to change. A lot of people say they want to change when they really don't. How many people have you heard say, oh, I really want to give up drinking, or I want to give up smoking, or I'm going to go exercise, right? My New Year's resolution is to go to the gym 3 times a week. But then they don't do it. The reality is that in those situations, those folks just don't have the will to change. And will is really the key. You also, of course, have to have the skill to change. You have to know how to implement the changes that you want to make. And in these cases, observing others can really help. If you look to another person and say, well, look how fit they are, maybe I'll do what they do. That kind of social comparison is a really good way to get started in terms of changing your self-concept in a positive way. All right, that's it for today's lecture. Thanks for checking it out.